In the annals of American criminal history, few cases have captured the intersection of mental illness, societal failure, and unspeakable acts quite like that of Hamilton Howard Albert Fish. Born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., Fish would become one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, his name forever etched in the darkest chapters of criminology. This is not merely the story of a killer, but a complex examination of how untreated mental illness, childhood trauma, and societal neglect can create a monster. Hamilton Howard Fish entered the world during the Reconstruction era, a time when America was struggling to heal from the wounds of civil war. His birth name would later be changed to Albert, after a deceased brother, in what would become the first of many identity shifts throughout his troubled life. Fish's early years were marked by abandonment and institutional neglect that would prove formative in shaping his psychological development. His father, Randall Fish, was 75 years old when Albert was born, while his mother, Ellen, was only 32. This significant age gap would soon become tragically relevant when Randall Fish died in 1875, leaving 5-year-old Albert effectively orphaned. Unable to care for her children, Ellen Fish made the fateful decision to place Albert in St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C. This institution, like many of its time, operated under harsh disciplinary methods that bordered on abuse. The orphanage employed corporal punishment as a standard practice, and young Albert experienced regular beatings and humiliation. Rather than deterring unwanted behavior, these punishments had a perverse effect on the boy's developing psyche. Fish would later claim that he began to associate pain with pleasure during these formative years at the orphanage. The regular beatings, public humiliations, and harsh treatment created what psychologists would now recognize as severe trauma responses. The institution's methods, designed to instill discipline and religious fear, instead fostered in Albert a complex relationship with suffering that would manifest in increasingly disturbing ways throughout his life. By age 7, Albert had begun to exhibit the early warning signs that modern criminologists recognize as indicators of severe psychological disturbance. He engaged in self-harm, showed fascination with pain, and demonstrated what would later be identified as early symptoms of what was then called religious mania, an obsessive fixation on religious themes often involving punishment and redemption. When his mother's financial situation improved in 1879, 9-year-old Albert was retrieved from the orphanage. However, the damage had been done. The boy who returned to his mother's care was fundamentally changed from the one who had been placed there. He exhibited behavioral problems that his mother, lacking any understanding of childhood psychology, was ill-equipped to address. During his adolescent years, Fish's behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. He claimed to have been visited by Christ and developed an obsession with religious themes, particularly those involving suffering and martyrdom. He began practicing self-flagellation and other forms of self-harm, behaviors that alarmed his family but were often dismissed as religious fervor rather than signs of severe mental illness. By his late teens, Fish had developed what he would later describe as an insatiable appetite for pain, both giving and receiving it. He sought out situations where he could experience physical suffering, and gradually began to inflict similar experiences on others, starting with animals and eventually progressing to human victims. As Albert Fish entered adulthood, the patterns established in his childhood began to manifest in increasingly dangerous ways. In 1890, at age 20, he moved to New York City, where the anonymity of urban life would provide cover for his developing criminal behavior. Fish's early adult years were marked by a series of relationships and marriages that were characterized by his increasingly bizarre sexual behavior and violent tendencies. He married Anna Mary Hoffman in 1898, and the couple would eventually have 6 children together. To outside observers, Fish appeared to be a devoted family man and a reliable worker in various manual labor jobs. This facade of normalcy would prove to be one of his most effective tools in evading suspicion for decades. However, behind the mask of respectability, Fish was developing into a sophisticated predator. He began to frequent areas where vulnerable children could be found, orphanages, boarding houses, and poor neighborhoods where parents might be less able to supervise their children closely. His modus operandi during this period involved gaining the trust of families, often by presenting himself as a kindly older man who took interest in their children's welfare. Fish's criminal activities during this period were not limited to his later notorious crimes. He engaged in various forms of fraud, theft, and what would now be recognized as child grooming behaviors. He would often offer to take children on outings or provide them with work opportunities, using these pretexts to isolate potential victims. The early 1900s also saw Fish's first documented instances of what psychiatrists would later identify as cannibalistic behavior. He claimed to have begun consuming human flesh during this period, though the exact timeline and extent of these activities remained unclear due to Fish's tendency toward exaggeration and fantasy in his later confessions. Fish's marriage to Anna Mary began to deteriorate as his behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. Anna Mary would later testify that her husband exhibited extreme religious obsessions, engaged in bizarre sexual practices, and showed disturbing fascination with pain and suffering. In 1917, she left him, taking their children and leaving Fish alone with his increasingly dark impulses. The period following his wife's departure marked a significant escalation in Fish's criminal behavior. Freed from the constraints of family life and the need to maintain a facade of normalcy at home, Fish began to act on his most violent impulses with increasing frequency. During the 1910s and 1920s, Fish claimed to have committed numerous murders, though law enforcement was only able to definitively link him to a handful of cases. His preferred victims were children, particularly those from poor or marginalized families whose disappearances might not receive extensive police attention. He demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to select victims who were least likely to be quickly missed or whose disappearances might be attributed to running away or other common explanations. Fish's methods during this period showed a level of planning and premeditation that contradicted any notion that his crimes were impulsive acts of madness. He would often spend weeks or months studying potential victims and their families, learning their routines and identifying opportunities for abduction. He maintained detailed mental records of his activities and showed remarkable ability to cover his tracks and avoid detection. The killer's psychological state during this period was characterized by what psychiatrists would later identify as a complex mixture of severe mental illness and calculating criminality. He experienced religious hallucinations and claimed to receive divine commands to commit various acts, yet simultaneously demonstrated clear awareness of the illegality of his actions and went to great lengths to avoid capture. Fish's crimes during this period were characterized by extreme brutality and what he later described as ritualistic elements. He claimed to have developed elaborate ceremonies around his killings, involving religious symbolism and cannibalistic practices. These accounts, given during his later capture and trial, provided insight into the mind of a killer whose motivations were far more complex than simple sadism or sexual gratification. The crime that would ultimately lead to Albert Fish's downfall began with what appeared to be a simple employment opportunity. In May 1928, Fish responded to a classified advertisement placed by 18-year-old Edward Budd, who was seeking work to help support his family during difficult economic times. The Budd family, living in a modest home in Manhattan, represented the kind of trusting, working-class family that Fish had successfully exploited in the past. Fish, presenting himself as Frank Howard, a wealthy farmer from Long Island, arrived at the Budd home on May 25, 1928. He was impeccably dressed and spoke with the refined manner of an educated gentleman. He told the family that he was seeking young men to work on his farm and that he had seen Edward's advertisement. The family was immediately impressed by this apparent benefactor who seemed to offer their son legitimate employment at good wages. During this initial visit, Fish demonstrated the manipulative skills that had served him throughout his criminal career. He engaged the entire family in conversation, showing particular interest in the children and presenting himself as a kindly grandfather figure. He spoke knowledgeably about farming and business, creating an impression of wealth and respectability that completely disarmed the family's natural caution. Fish told the family that he would return in a few days to collect Edward for work on his farm. However, when he returned on June 3, 1928, he had a different proposal. He explained that he had been delayed and couldn't take Edward immediately, but he had been invited to a birthday party for his niece and wondered if he might take one of the younger children along. 10-year-old Grace Budd, a bright and trusting child, immediately expressed interest in attending the party. Grace's parents, Albert and Delia Budd, were initially hesitant but were ultimately convinced by Fish's apparent respectability and his promise to return Grace that evening. Fish's ability to present himself as a trustworthy figure was so complete that the family felt comfortable allowing their daughter to leave with a man they had known for less than 2 weeks. Grace Budd left her family home that afternoon, dressed in her best clothes and excited about the party. She would never return home alive. When Grace Budd failed to return home that evening, her family's initial concern quickly turned to panic. They contacted the police, who began what would become one of the most extensive missing persons investigations in New York City history up to that point. Detective William King of the Missing Persons Bureau took charge of the case and immediately recognized several troubling aspects of Grace's disappearance. The story told by the Budd family about the mysterious Frank Howard raised numerous red flags, and King suspected from the beginning that Grace had been the victim of foul play rather than a simple kidnapping for ransom. The investigation quickly revealed that many of the details provided by Frank Howard were fabricated. There was no wealthy farm owner by that name on Long Island, and the address he had provided to the family was fictitious. The telephone number he had given was traced to a vacant house, and the birthday party story appeared to be entirely invented. Detective King and his team began the painstaking process of tracking down leads and attempting to identify the man who had taken Grace. They interviewed numerous witnesses, followed up on reported sightings, and pursued every possible angle. The case attracted significant media attention, and Grace's photograph appeared in newspapers throughout the region. Despite the extensive investigation, the case quickly went cold. Without modern forensic techniques or communication systems, tracking down a man who had given false information and disappeared into the anonymity of New York City proved nearly impossible. The Budd family was left in agonizing uncertainty, not knowing whether their daughter was alive or dead, and clinging to the hope that she might somehow be returned to them. Detective King, however, refused to give up on the case. He continued to pursue leads and maintain the investigation even as other cases demanded his attention. His persistence would eventually prove crucial to bringing Albert Fish to justice, though it would take 6 years of patient detective work to achieve that goal. The years following Grace Budd's disappearance were marked by frustration and false hope for both her family and the investigating officers. Detective King received hundreds of tips and reported sightings, each of which had to be carefully investigated and ultimately ruled out. The case file grew thick with dead-end leads, mistaken identities, and the desperate hopes of a family that refused to give up. During this period, Albert Fish continued his criminal activities with apparent impunity. He claimed later to have committed several additional murders during these years, though investigators were never able to confirm all of his boasts. Fish demonstrated a remarkable ability to blend into society, working various jobs and maintaining the appearance of a harmless, if eccentric, older man. Fish's psychological state during this period appeared to deteriorate further. He later claimed to have experienced increasingly vivid hallucinations and divine visions that commanded him to commit various acts. He engaged in extreme self-harm, inserting needles into his body and subjecting himself to various forms of torture that he believed were commanded by God. The killer's religious obsessions during this period became even more pronounced. He claimed to have received specific instructions from biblical figures and believed that his crimes were part of a divine plan. This religious mania provided him with a rationalization for his actions while simultaneously feeding his psychological need for ritualistic behavior. Meanwhile, the Budd family struggled with the uncertainty of not knowing their daughter's fate. Grace's mother, Delia, never gave up hope that her daughter might return, while her father, Albert, became increasingly despondent. The family's tragedy was compounded by the financial strain of the ongoing investigation and the emotional toll of living with unresolved grief. Detective King continued his methodical investigation throughout this period, following up on new leads and periodically reviewing the case file for missed clues. He maintained contact with the Budd family and repeatedly assured them that the case remained active and that he would not rest until Grace's fate was determined. On November 11, 1934, 6 years after Grace Budd's disappearance, the case took a dramatic turn that would finally lead to Albert Fish's capture. Mrs. Delia Budd received an anonymous letter that contained horrific details about her daughter's fate. The letter, written in a barely literate scrawl, claimed to provide the true story of what had happened to Grace. The letter's contents were so disturbing that Mrs. Budd was unable to read it in its entirety. She immediately contacted Detective King, who who recognized that the letter contained details that only Grace's killer could have known. The letter writer claimed not only to have murdered Grace but also provided graphic descriptions of cannibalistic acts that he claimed to have committed. Detective King understood immediately that this letter represented the breakthrough he had been seeking for 6 years. However, he also recognized that the letter's author was clearly attempting to torment the Budd family with horrific details about their daughter's death. The psychological cruelty of sending such a letter to grieving parents revealed a level of sadism that went beyond the original crime. The letter was written on stationery from a rooming house, and this detail provided King with his first solid lead in years. He traced the stationery to a boarding house in New York City and began the process of identifying which resident might have written the letter. This investigation required careful questioning of the boarding house's residents and staff without alerting the letter writer that he was being sought. Through methodical detective work, King was able to narrow down the list of suspects to a handful of men who had access to the stationery. One name that emerged was Albert Fish, a 64-year-old handyman who had been living at the boarding house but had recently moved out. When King obtained a sample of Fish's handwriting, he found that it matched the writing in the letter to Mrs. Budd. King's investigation revealed that Fish had a history of bizarre behavior and had been reported to authorities on several occasions for suspicious activities involving children. The detective also discovered that Fish had been using multiple aliases and had a pattern of targeting vulnerable families. Armed with the knowledge of Fish's true identity and his connection to the letter, Detective King launched an intensive manhunt. Fish had left the boarding house and was believed to be somewhere in the New York City area, but locating one man among millions of residents required careful strategy and coordination with other law enforcement agencies. King utilized every resource available to him, distributing Fish's photograph to police stations throughout the city and alerting officers to be on the lookout for the suspect. He also coordinated with federal authorities, as there was a possibility that Fish might have fled to another state to avoid capture. The breakthrough came when Fish was spotted at another rooming house in Manhattan. On December 13, 1934, King and several other officers surrounded the building and arrested Fish without incident. The suspect appeared surprised by his capture but did not resist arrest or attempt to deny his identity. Fish's arrest marked the end of one of the longest-running missing persons investigations in New York City history. However, it also marked the beginning of a complex legal and psychiatric examination that would reveal the full extent of Fish's crimes and provide insight into the mind of one of America's most notorious serial killers. During his initial interrogation, Fish appeared calm and cooperative. He readily admitted to writing the letter to Mrs. Budd and acknowledged that he had killed Grace. However, his detailed confessions would prove to be a mixture of truth, fantasy, and psychological manipulation that would challenge investigators and psychiatrists for months to come. Following his arrest, Albert Fish proved to be remarkably forthcoming about his crimes, though investigators soon learned to approach his confessions with considerable skepticism. Fish claimed to have committed hundreds of crimes over several decades, including numerous murders, kidnappings, and acts of cannibalism. While some of these claims were clearly exaggerated or entirely fictional, others provided investigators with leads to previously unsolved cases. Fish's confession regarding Grace Budd's murder was particularly detailed and disturbing. He described how he had taken the child to an abandoned house in Westchester County, New York, where he had killed her. His account included graphic details about cannibalistic acts that he claimed to have committed over the course of several days following the murder. The killer's confessions were characterized by a mixture of religious justification and apparent pleasure in recounting the details of his crimes. He claimed that he had been commanded by God to commit these acts and that he had been chosen as an instrument of divine will. This religious framework appeared to provide him with both rationalization for his actions and a sense of importance and purpose. Detective King and other investigators worked to verify Fish's confessions by locating physical evidence and connecting his accounts to known missing persons cases. This process was complicated by Fish's tendency to embellish his stories and his apparent inability to distinguish between actual events and his own fantasies. One of the cases that investigators were able to confirm was the 1927 murder of 4-year-old Billy Gaffney in Brooklyn. Fish provided details about this crime that had not been made public, and his account matched physical evidence found at the time. This confirmation lent credibility to other aspects of his confessions, though investigators remained cautious about accepting all of his claims at face value. Fish also confessed to the 1924 murder of 8-year-old Frances McDonnell on Staten Island. Again, he provided details that only the killer could have known, and investigators were able to connect physical evidence to his account. These confirmations established Fish as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history up to that point. Given the bizarre nature of Fish's crimes and his apparent mental illness, the court ordered extensive psychiatric evaluation to determine his competency to stand trial and his mental state at the time of the murders. This examination, conducted by several of the era's leading psychiatrists, provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. Dr. Frederick Wertham, a prominent psychiatrist who would later become famous for his work on the effects of comic books on children, led the psychiatric evaluation. Wertham's examination of Fish revealed a complex psychological profile that challenged contemporary understanding of criminal insanity and psychopathology. The psychiatric evaluation uncovered the extent of Fish's self-destructive behavior and masochistic tendencies. X-rays of his body revealed numerous needles that he had inserted into his pelvis and abdomen over the years, some of which had become embedded so deeply that they could not be removed. Fish claimed that he had inserted these needles as a form of religious penance and that the pain brought him closer to God. Fish's religious delusions were found to be extensive and complex. He claimed to have received direct communications from God, Jesus Christ, and various saints and biblical figures. These hallucinations often commanded him to commit violent acts, which he interpreted as divine tests of his faith and obedience. The psychiatrists noted that Fish's religious obsessions were unlike typical religious mania, as they were specifically focused on themes of pain, sacrifice, and consumption. The examination also revealed Fish's cannibalistic practices, which he described in detail to the psychiatrists. He claimed that consuming human flesh was a religious sacrament and that it provided him with spiritual nourishment. His descriptions of these acts were matter-of-fact and showed no apparent remorse or recognition of their abnormality. Dr. Wertham's evaluation concluded that Fish suffered from multiple severe mental disorders, including what would now be diagnosed as schizophrenia, sexual sadism, and various paraphilias. However, the psychiatrist also noted that Fish demonstrated clear awareness of the illegality of his actions and had taken significant steps to avoid detection, which complicated the question of his legal insanity. Albert Fish's trial began on March 11, 1935, in the Westchester County Courthouse in White Plains, New York. The case attracted enormous media attention, with reporters from across the country covering what many newspapers described as the trial of the century. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators eager to witness the proceedings against one of America's most notorious criminals. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Walter Ferris, faced the challenging task of proving not only that Fish had committed murder but also that he was legally sane at the time of the crime. Under New York state law, a defendant could be found not guilty by reason of insanity if it could be proven that he did not understand the nature and consequences of his actions at the time of the crime. Fish's defense attorney, James Dempsey, argued that his client was clearly insane and therefore not legally responsible for his actions. Dempsey presented evidence of Fish's extensive history of mental illness, his bizarre religious delusions, and his self-destructive behavior as proof that he could not distinguish right from wrong. The trial featured dramatic testimony from psychiatrists, investigators, and members of the Budd family. Mrs. Delia Budd's testimony about receiving the horrific letter from Fish was particularly powerful, and there were few dry eyes in the courtroom as she described her years of anguish and uncertainty about her daughter's fate. Detective King testified about his 6-year investigation and Fish's eventual capture and confession. His methodical presentation of the evidence demonstrated the careful police work that had finally brought Fish to justice and provided the jury with a clear timeline of the crimes. The psychiatric testimony proved to be the most controversial aspect of the trial. Dr. Wertham testified that Fish was severely mentally ill but argued that his ability to plan his crimes and avoid detection suggested that he understood the wrongfulness of his actions. Other psychiatrists disagreed, arguing that Fish's mental illness was so severe that he could not be held legally responsible for his behavior. Fish himself proved to be an unsettling presence in the courtroom. He appeared calm and often smiled inappropriately during testimony about his crimes. When given the opportunity to address the court, he spoke in rambling, disconnected sentences about his religious visions and his belief that he had been chosen by God for a special mission. After deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. The jurors rejected the insanity defense, apparently convinced that Fish's ability to plan his crimes and evade capture for years demonstrated sufficient mental capacity to hold him legally responsible for his actions. Judge Frederick Close sentenced Albert Fish to death by electric chair, stating that the defendant's crimes were so heinous and his danger to society so great that the ultimate punishment was warranted. Fish showed no visible reaction to the sentence and was reported to have smiled as he was led from the courtroom. The verdict was appealed on grounds of legal insanity, but the appeals court upheld the conviction and sentence. The court noted that while Fish was clearly mentally ill, the evidence showed that he understood the nature of his crimes and had taken steps to conceal them, which demonstrated sufficient mental capacity for legal responsibility. During his time on death row at Sing Sing prison, Fish continued to exhibit bizarre behavior. He claimed to be looking forward to his execution, saying that being electrocuted would be the supreme thrill of his life. He wrote numerous letters to newspapers and individuals, many of which contained disturbing content that prison officials refused to deliver. Fish also continued to make confessions to additional crimes, though prison officials and investigators treated these claims with skepticism. His tendency to exaggerate and fantasize made it difficult to determine which, if any, of his new claims were truthful. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. He was 65 years old and had spent his final months on death row writing letters and making bizarre religious pronouncements. According to witnesses, Fish appeared calm and even eager as he was prepared for execution. The execution itself was reportedly complicated by the numerous needles embedded in Fish's body, which may have interfered with the electrical current. However, the procedure was ultimately successful, bringing an end to the life of one of America's most notorious serial killers. Fish's death marked the conclusion of a case that had captivated and horrified the American public. His crimes had revealed the darkest aspects of human nature and raised troubling questions about the relationship between mental illness and criminal responsibility. The case also highlighted the importance of persistent detective work and the dedication of law enforcement officers like Detective King, who refused to give up on a seemingly impossible case. King's 6-year investigation became a model for missing persons cases and demonstrated the value of methodical, patient police work. The Albert Fish case remains one of the most studied serial killer cases in American criminal history. It has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and academic papers examining various aspects of the crimes, the investigation, and the legal proceedings. From a criminological perspective, Fish's case provided early insights into the psychology of serial killers and the complex relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior. His ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing horrific crimes demonstrated the sophisticated nature of many serial offenders and the challenges they present to law enforcement. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of children from poor and marginalized families, who were often Fish's preferred targets. His ability to exploit the trust of families desperate for economic opportunities revealed societal vulnerabilities that continue to be relevant today. The psychiatric examination of Fish contributed to the evolving understanding of criminal insanity and the legal standards for determining mental competency. The case helped establish precedents for how courts should handle defendants with severe mental illness while maintaining public safety and legal accountability. For the families of Fish's victims, the case brought both closure and continued pain. While they finally learned the fate of their loved ones, the horrific details of the crimes created additional trauma that lasted for generations. The Budd family, in particular, became symbols of resilience and the enduring impact of violent crime on survivors. The case also demonstrated the power of media coverage in criminal cases and raised questions about the balance between public interest and the privacy rights of victims' families. The extensive newspaper coverage of Fish's trial set precedents for how high-profile criminal cases would be reported in the future. Today, the Albert Fish case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals seeking to understand the minds of serial killers and improve methods for preventing and solving such crimes. His case remains a stark reminder of the capacity for human evil and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. The story of Albert Fish serves as both a historical record of one of America's most notorious criminals and a cautionary tale about the consequences of untreated mental illness, childhood trauma, and societal neglect. While his crimes were undeniably evil, his case also provides valuable insights into the complex factors that can create a killer and the dedication required to bring such criminals to justice. In the end, the Albert Fish case stands as a testament to both the darkest aspects of human nature and the persistence of those who seek justice for the innocent. It remains a cornerstone case in the study of criminal psychology and a sobering reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting children and other vulnerable members of society from those who would do them harm.